Am I happy that my parents left 31 years ago? I'm ecstatic. I mean, who knows what would have happened otherwise. When I came to this country, I came, first my parents came, then my grandmother came a little bit later. And there was another grandmother who stayed behind, and I never saw her again. She died right when the perestroika was beginning to happen. So my mother went to her funeral in, I think it was 85, 86. I never went, so I never saw her again. But we came and we moved first to Kew Gardens, to a little garden apartment. And I remember all the local Jews gathered furniture for us, so we had a whole selection of furniture. No television though, just furniture. And eventually we moved to Little Neck, which is further out in Queens, on the border of Queens and Long Island. One of the last things I remember about Leningrad, and it was a scene that actually was written in my first book, The Russian Debutante's Handbook, was the Pulkovo airport, where you fly out from Leningrad, or Petersburg now. I was wearing a big fur hat, and the tamozhnik, the gentleman who is in the customs area, took the hat off and began to pry it apart for diamonds. You know, he was looking for diamonds or jewelry or anything else that we would try to sneak out of Russia, gold. There wasn't anything in there, but it was a very strange experience, which kind of summarizes how we felt about the Soviet Union, I think, this very invasive experience and somebody wanting to take something away from you, whether it's your heritage or diamonds. Being an immigrant from the Soviet Union affects me now. It affects me less and less. I mean, I think, you know, as with anything, time passes. You become more adapted. I think with this last book especially, which Super Sad True Love Story, which is set almost entirely in America, where the character is American-born, although of Russian heritage. With each book, with each decade here, I've begun to become more adapted, if not to America as a whole, then certainly to New York as a city. When I came here, it was a terrible emotional shock, because for a 7-year-old child, I was already very much embedded in the Russian language and culture, which seems strange, I was so young, but I developed very quickly. And my grandmother, when I was very young, when I was 5 years old, the grandmother that stayed in the Soviet Union and died, had me write a small novel about, you know, I wrote about Lenin, because there was a big statue of Lenin on Moskovsky Prospekt, the part of Leningrad where I grew up, and a magical goose that I was in love with as a child. So, you know, from the very beginning, there was a very big attachment, great attachment to language, to culture, Russian culture, and, you know, you wouldn't call it Soviet culture, but the Soviet myths that I grew up with. For me, the worst was coming to America and being plunged into this society which I didn't understand. And the plunge for me was alienating in two different ways. One, of course, being in America, a country I couldn't quite understand, a country that's larger than life. And also being plunged into a yeshiva, into a Hebrew school, where there was a second language to be learned, Hebrew, which I never quite learned, and where there was a lot of difficulties, to the extent where I would tell some of the children in a Hebrew school that I was born in East Germany and not Russia, because somehow being German was better than being Russian back in 1980, back in the time of Reagan and the Evil Empire, where there were all these movies, you know, Red Dawn, Red Hamster. I mean, there was all these. Being Russian was very, I mean, I can't even imagine what the analogy would be today. We weren't aiming missiles at each other the way they were now, where our entire life could have been destroyed in an instant by the people who I was supposed to represent. Toward the end of it, I began to make my first friends in America. And the way I began to make those friends was interesting. It was through writing. The smarter kids, and I think almost everyone had had enough of the Torah and the Talmud that was relentlessly drilled into our brains. So I wrote a copy of a version of the Torah called the Gemara, you know, and Exodus became Sexodus and all these different things. And, you know, the kids laughed. And through that, I began to make my first good friends. And some of these people I'm still in touch with to this day, one in particular, my best friend from that time. We forged a real bond. And they were always, you know, what was interesting, the school, of course, had a very conservative bent to it, but there were a couple of liberal, nice liberal families, and they said, you know, you have to play with Gary. Nobody's going to play with him. And so they would invite me to their house, and these were the sweetest, the kindest people. But for the most part, nobody knew what to make of me. Well, my parents were very lucky in a sense that when they came here, the character in my last book, Super Sad True Love Story, is very, his father came from Moscow and was an engineer, but became a janitor in America. And he's very angry about this, you know. And one thing I could say is my parents did not go through that. They worked in a factory when they came for a very short period of time. My mother was employed right here in HIAS, as a fiscal administrator. And my father was employed as an engineer in Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island. So they were very lucky that, in the sense that they both were white-collar people, because that's a fate that doesn't befall all immigrants. I mean, they're talented people, but often it's not even talent that determines this. It's the stroke of luck, when you came, who you met. Some people wanted to help us out. Some people wanted to help my father out at the laboratory, and he was employed there for several decades. So a lot of luck, but also endless work and endless worry. In a sense, the uncertainty of America that I see around me during the Great Recession and whatever else is going to happen next sort of mirrors that feeling of uncertainty that when I grew up, which is one of the reasons I wanted to write a novel such as the last one, which is about an America in a state of very deep decline, because I think that's the natural state of being I remember being as a child, constantly worrying what's going to happen next to our family. There's been a lot of influences from Russia. I really did grow up with Chekhov as a kind of, I think a lot of Russians read Chekhov not just because the prose is so beautiful, but because there's a kind of moral model involved. That, Chekhov was a man way ahead of his time. He was ahead of Freud in a certain sense, in terms of analyzing people's motivations and what makes life both the infrequent joy that it is, and often the great sadness that it is. And so growing up reading, and I didn't, you're a 9-year-old kid, you're reading some of Chekhov's earlier stories, you understand it all quite well. The later stories, In the Ravine, Lady with Lapdog, they're a little bit harder to understand. But you still sense that something important is being said. After that, growing up, becoming a teenager, Nabokov became a big influence, because nobody can craft a sentence like him. But also trying to understand my parents' world, reading Dovlatov or Vainovich, trying to understand a bizarre system like the Soviet Union, and then trying to connect with what that could mean for trying to understand who my parents are, what kind of people, the good and the bad. How do they end up being who they are, And seeing both the incredible pessimism that I think is a part of Soviet life, and Soviet Jewish life certainly, and also seeing the great humor that arises from that pessimism. Well, I've always wanted to write, because I think, first of all, I'm not good at too many other things, I grew up in a very verbal family. My grandmother wrote. Everyone communicated through words and writing and Brezhnev jokes, which I thought were hilarious as a child. It was just this very dynamic environment. One of the problems with reading in decline is if you don't read to your child, the child is not going to be a reader. I was read to by almost everybody around me. There was more time spent reading than anything else. And that's the kind of thing that prepares you to become a writer. You have to love language more than anything. In a sense, language is my religion. That's what I respect the most, and what I look up to the most, and what excites me the most. I don't have, one thing I'm never afflicted with is writer's block. I wake up, I'm just happy to start writing. That's all I look forward to in the day.